Hi, my name's Darren. I'm the D in JD Creative Works. We're a husband and wife team working on the central coast of California. I work full-time helping to run a busy wine tasting room here on the central coast, but my wife and I also like to be creative. I'm a photographer, my wife likes to sew, so this YouTube thing's a little new, but I'd like to do some wine reviews coming from a slightly different angle. You may see, if you go to jdcreativeworks.com, some reviews I've done on wines at various prices. My wife and I, though, aren't made of money, so the wines I'd like to review tend to be on the less expensive side. Before I get into the review, I'd like to talk a little about residual sugar in wine. Those of us, like my wife and I, who follow a low carbohydrate diet, tend to like to keep an eye on sugars. And while dry wines don't contain a huge amount of sugar, if you're watching the numbers, it is nice to know. Red wines generally, aside from dessert wines, tend to have less than 1% residual sugar, but it can be a little more. So first off, let's look at how wine is made. The grapes, when they come in, usually have more than 20% sugar in the grapes, can be even more than 30 for some wines. The yeast eats up all the sugar in the fruit and gives us delicious alcohol, but there's always a little sugar left over. In some wines it's negligible, but in others it can be a little more. If the yeast doesn't completely ferment, or in the case of some wines where a juice concentrate is added to make it a little more palatable, then the residual sugars can be a little higher. And of course, to those of us following a low carbohydrate diet, this can be of great interest. So I've got a couple of wines to try today, but rather than just go by what the manufacturers say, because while most wineries, if you contact them, they're happy to give you the figures, wines before they get bottled usually get lab tested, and they'll give you the residual sugar or give the winery the residual sugar content. Now, that can be separated when you do lab testing into glucose, fructose, but also the unfermentable sugars, the non-fermentable sugars. These are the pentose sugars. But what we're interested in mostly is glucose and fructose. So yeast tend to metabolize glucose sugars more quickly than fructose. So if there are any sugars left, they're usually mostly fructose. But of course, in a dry wine, it's not a huge amount, but we're here today just to have a look at the figures and see how much might be involved. So the way we're going to test for sugars today is using some AIM-TAB reducing substances tablets. I got these from a local winemaking supply store. Usually these are purchased by diabetics who like to test their urine sugar content, but they can also be used for wine, and that's what we'll do today. So these are the wines that we're going to try today. Both less than $10 at my local grocery outlet. So we're not looking at expensive wine here, but it would be interesting to see not only how they compare taste-wise, but what their levels of residual sugar are. First off, we have Terra Blanca Triple Threat. This is a wine from Washington State. It's mostly Cabernet Sauvignon. We also have Clos d'Argentine. This is a Cabernet Sauvignon from Argentina. So before we find out how they compare in flavor, let's have a look at our little test and see what the residual sugars are. Okay, so we have our AIM-TAB reducing substances tablets. We have our 3 samples of wine. We'll start by testing a Central Coast Pinot Noir. The reason I've chosen this one is because it's been lab tested. And this is, while it is under 1% residual sugar, it's 6.5 grams per litre. That's of glucose and fructose. Doesn't include non-fermentable sugars, so we can expect the reading to be a little higher than that. But as this is the upper end of the scale, it's a good place to start. So we take our tablet, we have half a milliliter of wine. We drop our tablet in. We'll start to see a color change and a boiling reaction. Agitate a little, make sure the tablet's being completely covered. we can watch the color change to green, up to brown, up to the amber color. Now it's getting a little darker. Supposed to wait 15 seconds after the boiling reaction stops. You can pop the lid on, agitate, and check it against the cart. This did go right up to 1%, so we can clearly say that this is, including those non-fermentable sugars, roughly 1%. So that's 10 grams of sugar per litre. Perhaps a little higher. We'd have to do a test with a slightly diluted amount. But it's good enough for our purposes. We can see that that's at the higher end of the scale. And there we have our benchmark. The next wine, this is the Terra Blanca, our Cabernet Sauvignon blend from Washington State. I contacted the winery for this wine. They were good enough to get back to me, let me know this is a dry wine, so below 1% residual sugar. Now immediately we can see the difference. So from this test we can see between 0.2 or 0.2 and 0.4 residual sugar. So definitely a drier wine than the Pinot Noir. Okay, so finally we have Clos d'Argentine. This is our Cabernet Sauvignon from Argentina. I emailed the winery about this wine, didn't get any response, so let's see what kind of results we get here. Definitely a brown. Still got some green to it. So the results seem pretty good for this one too. A little higher than the Terra Blanca. So including non-fermentable sugars, we're looking at 0.6%. So assuming the test is accurate here, we can clearly see which is the drier wine. Having done our little test, we can conclude that both of these are dry wines. They're less than 1% sugar per litre. So we're looking a little less in the Terra Blanca. There's roughly 3 grams a litre. So for a bottle, about 2¼ to 2½ grams of sugar, including the non-fermentable. So nice dry wine. And the Clos d'Argentine, this one is roughly 6 grams a litre, so still dry. Per bottle we're looking at roughly 4½ grams of sugar, including the non-fermentable. So both dry wines. And another reason why I chose these is alcohol, of course, is a neurotoxin, and when you're on a low carbohydrate diet it can affect you pretty quickly, more so than it always used to. I'm sure most people find the same as I did with that. Both of these are below 14% alcohol, which is always a bonus. It's time to taste the wine, finally. So first off, we'll try the Clos d'Argentine Cabernet Sauvignon. A lot of ripe fruit to it, not a huge amount of oak influence on the nose. But at this price point, you don't expect to find a huge amount of oak. Oak barrels are expensive. And it's usually the much more expensive wines that have that. So there's a little cedar on the nose. Let's see how it tastes. Pretty good, especially for the money. I would say medium bodied, very ripe fruit. Normally with Cabernet Sauvignon, I'm used to finding cherry, blackberry flavors. This is a little higher on the red spectrum. Kind of a red currant cherry thing there. Very pleasant wine. Let's see how the next one is. More oak to this one, I would say. You're getting a little element of baking spices in there. More earthy for sure. Fruit character is definitely darker fruit than the other one. We're talking more on the kind of blackberry cherry spectrum. Wow. Tannin really goes on this one. It's not a hugely tannic wine. It's very fine, very velvety on the palate, but it definitely builds more than the Argentinian wine. A little bit of meatiness to it. I know that sounds odd, but I've had a Syrah from these guys, which had a kind of cured meat characteristic to it. You don't usually find that in Bordeaux wines. However, this does have some Syrah in there, so that may be from that. More on the earthier side, but the fruit character is nice and ripe. Also a very pleasant wine. I would say if you prefer fruit forward, easy drinking kind of wine, then the Clos d'Argentine is excellent value. Personally though, my preference, I'm used to European wines, and this suits me very well. I think I'll buy some more of this. So I hope you enjoyed my little review here. In future, I'd like to see what kind of wines I can get for less than $10 that come under the bracket of below 14% alcohol, but also relatively low residual sugars. I know it's not a huge difference between 3 grams a litre and 6, but if you're watching the numbers, then it can be something that's definitely worth looking into. The test kits are fairly expensive, so I don't know how many wines I'll do this with, but it could be, let me know in the notes below if you any kind of feedback here, anything I can do to improve the videos, or if there are any particular wines that you'd like me to try. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you.